Hey guys, this is Mega Cat Studios. We're doing a panel on retro game design, surpassing limits with creativity. We're going to be looking at how we look at making retro games with more of a modern lens and using that to work around some of the limitations of those retro consoles. So I'll start with introducing myself. My name is Andrew Marsh. I'm the lead designer at Mega Cat Studios. I'm kind of the guy that takes those high level design concepts and mashes them all up into little bits and gets them to work on an NES.
I'm Zack. I work with Andy closely on taking those high level designs and into a game that's fun and enjoyable.
Jason Vanderwall, Director of Brand Engagement. I do a lot of work taking in new clients, new brands, new goals, and translating them into successful games and riffing off of retro mechanics and everything that makes games fun.
So when we're looking at making games for retro consoles, we're looking at what tool chains we're going to be using. And so we get to use a nice mix of just in-house proprietary tools as well as modern design tools. So when we do visuals, we can use anything from very specified tools to create retro pixel art like YYCHR, or we could use modern tools like Photoshop or GIMP, as long as we're sticking within the restrictions of the console that we're working on. That's all that really matters. For the sound, we're going to be using specific trackers that export chiptunes within the actual limitations of the console, as well as in a way that the console will understand. Gameplay, we're looking at what makes retro gameplay fun. What was great about retro gameplay? And I think that sort of retro sensibility when it comes to raw gameplay especially applies to indie games now. Um, Finally, there's a lot of people bring up NES Maker now because that's out there. It's a great tool for prototyping for us. We do that to prototype concepts, and as it develops more and more, we're getting really excited about using it for smaller scale games. So on the next slide, we're just looking at a high level overview of what we're going to be talking about here. It's working with restrictions on the consoles. We're going to be focusing mainly on the NES because it has the most restrictions out of any of the platforms. All the retro platforms do tile-based graphic storage. So when I talk about that, I'm talking about how instead of storing a full image into the game's ROM, it's actually storing the image broken up into little 8 by 8 tiles. And that's something that we always have to be aware of when we're designing the graphics. There's palette restrictions on the character sprites, there's palette restrictions on the backgrounds that we'll be going over. There's limitations on the amount of character sprites we can have on screen, the size of character sprites we can have on screen. There's restrictions on the amount of character sprites that can be on the same horizontal row, and it will stop rendering them after that. And then we'll be looking at things like background limitations, like attribute tables that we'll get into a little bit later, that decide how the palettes get loaded into backgrounds, and it's actually quite restrictive on the NES how it does that.
So, since there's so many restrictions on the retro consoles, that's one of the things you really take into account when designing the game from the ground up. You have to kind of be aware of those and then think about either the best way to work around them or the best way to work with them.
Mm-hmm.
And we found that if you stop thinking about them as limitations and more think about them as a way to guide the design and art process, they can actually be kind of fun to work with, where it forces you to be creative in new and different ways because you know that you don't have, endless memory or endless colors to play with. So it really helps you to kind of focus in on certain aspects of the game and how to highlight those.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I always like to think of them less as restrictions and more as tools. So on this slide, we're going to be looking at iteration and retro development. Zach, I'd love for you to start on this one with some of the high-level design concepts.
Sure. So as we just said, when designing a retro game, you really need to take into account the different limitations of the console into account and how those will affect the design and the choices you make. And as Andy mentioned, you think about them more as tools and less of limitations, and really starts to kind of take form. So it affects everything from the type of game you're going to make to how the sprites are going to look, what size the sprites can be, and then once you have those things kind of nailed down, you tend to build like the rest of the game around it.
Yeah, exactly. And once we sort of have those high level concepts, then we start looking into like really hard, like hardware limitations, like the CPU and PPU, which is the graphics processor, the limitations of those pieces of hardware themselves, and the limitations of what sprites we're going to have on screen at the same time, because you can only have so many of them, so you have to make choices about enemies and what kind of enemies there's going to be. So those are the things we tend to look out after we start getting some of the high level ideas down.
Would you guys say that there's any consideration given towards expectations for modern users, fans that are buying a retro collectible plastic cartridge, but at the same time might be looking for any other like modern design elements? Is there consideration given at this stage of it, or no?
Yeah, I'd say absolutely. We even though we're making games for retro consoles, we still want to make games for everybody. So we can't just make games that will only appeal to people that play the retro hardware. We want to make games that will appeal to new people who have never played an NES before. And so we need to keep those modern sensibilities in mind as well.
And the reverse is also true, where there's a lot of things about retro games that do appeal to modern gamers. So our process is always taking the best of, the gaming's past and gaming's future, what works today and then what worked in the past and marrying them into, a perfect product in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Makes sense.
So the next one's a fun one for me. I like talking about this one because it talks about how a CRT television works, and I love CRT televisions. So we talk about scanline limitations, and what those mean are the way a CRT television renders its image is that there's about a 1 pixel thick line that there's a bunch of them that run every other line through the screen, top to bottom, and then it renders them bottom to top, and it does that every single frame. Now on the NES, you can only have 8 of those 8x8 sprite tiles on a scan line at a time, or else it will stop rendering anything beyond that. When I say stop rendering, I mean it just won't show it at all.
And when you say sprite tiles, what type of things would be considered sprites like in a typical game?
So if you look at, say, Super Mario Brothers, a Goomba in Super Mario Brothers is a 16 by 16 character sprite, and then that, when it's loaded into the visual memory of the console, is actually broken up into 4 8 by 8 sprite tiles. So you can have 8 of those 8 by 8 sprite tiles in a horizontal row before it stops showing stuff.
So it'd be things like characters and
Yeah,
enemies, projectiles.
characters, enemies, projectiles, items, all that kind of stuff.
With that in mind, when we design games, we have to think about not only the size of our characters. Obviously, if you can only fit 8 wide on the screen or on a line rather, you can't have a character that's that big. Same thing with the different types of attacks they can do. If the projectiles are moving in a flat trajectory, you have to think about that as well. So it all comes down to like everything from the design of the level itself to the placement of enemies to the art of the enemies to the art of the characters to how those things interact. It's just one thing you always have to consider.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great segue into the next slide. Is how do we get around that limitation? Because that limitation is extremely limiting. So this is an old trick. They've been doing it ever since back in the day. It's called sprite flickering. And what they do is when there's over 8 of those sprite tiles in a horizontal row at once, they'll flicker sprites off and on. So they'll turn the sprite off, turn it on, and they'll alternate that between 2 characters back and forth really quickly. They'll do it every frame. And that way, to the human eye, it looks like there's both sprites are being rendered on screen at the same time, but what's actually happening is every frame it's alternating back and forth between them. And I have a little example for Mega Man here because they used it a lot in those games so they could have larger, more animated enemy sprites. So once we get all of that sprite stuff out of the way, then we have to start looking about how palettes are loaded into the game. And this is extremely limiting on the NES, and you have to be really creative with how you use it. So when we talk about character sprites, it's not too bad. The way it works is you have 4 character sprite palettes, 4 background palettes loaded on screen at the same time. You can't have any more than that. When you're doing a character sprite, each 8x8 sprite tile is allowed to have one of those 4 palettes assigned to it. It's not too hard to work with. You can come up with some cool combinations with that. But when we talk about backgrounds, we start talking about what are called attribute tables. What the attribute tables are is basically you take the background image and slice it up into a 16 by 16 pixel grid. Now every single slice of that grid can have a single palette assigned to it. So what ends up happening is that we have to think of tricks to sort of make it look a little bit less like a grid and a little bit more natural. So one of the best go-to ones for that would be making 2 of those background palettes share a color. That way they can sort of bleed into each other a little bit. And sort of designing the art in a way that works within a grid but has some more rocky, jagged, natural shapes to it.
I also think it's important to mention that several of the retro consoles have a limited number of colors, not only that they can show at a time, but just a limited number of colors in general. How many colors in the NES palette? It's like, what? I know it's...
I don't remember the exact number offhand. It's not very big, though.
Yeah. Maybe we should redo that.
Nah, it's all right. But I mean that brings up an interesting little anecdote too. It's the reason why Mega Man is blue. When they were originally designing Mega Man, they wanted him to be red, but the NES only has 3 shades of red, whereas it has about 12 shades of blue, I believe. And so they realized, like, oh, well, why wouldn't we make him blue? There's like all of these shades of blue that we can use, and
Yeah.
that ended up deciding what color that character was.
It's better at the cooler colors than the warmer colors in general.
Yeah, totally. So when we get into talking about backgrounds, we got to talk about using meta tiles. So what meta tiles are is we take those 8x8 tiles for the background and we arrange them into predetermined blocks of tiles. So we'll say, let's make it like a 16 by 16 or a 32 by 32 defined block of tiles. And then we'll make an array of those defined blocks and store that in the ROM and use that to make our levels. The reason why we do that is because it saves a ton of space. Anytime you add any unique information to a game, it takes up more space. So if we build everything out of this array of predefined shapes, then that greatly limits the amount of unique information that's being used.
I think a famous example of this is if you look at the bushes and clouds in Super Mario Brothers, you'll notice that it's the same meta tile of background art. It just has different palettes. You know, the bushes are green and the clouds are blue and white, but it's the same art.
Yeah, and this trick's been used pretty much in any NES platformer that you remember and love. Castlevania uses 32 by 32s. Mega Man uses 16 by 16s. They all did it that way. They could make these bigger worlds without taking up a ton of space. The Legend of Zelda is a pretty great one. They're actually full vertical columns of the map is a meta tile.
I didn't know
So
that.
a 16 pixel wide, the entire column, that's a meta tile that's being used.
Like Andy said, the whole reason we do that is to save space because, I mean, we want to put as much game as we can on these, especially with the considerations for the modern players who, you know, are expecting these expansive worlds that they're used to, you know, with on modern consoles and PC and whatnot. So we had to squeeze as much as we can out of the space we have, you know, put as much game and fun and content into these to give the players, you know, what they deserve.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next slide just has an example of a meta tile table that we used in a game. We did 16 by 16 meta tiles on this one. It was an underwater themed level, so we had rocks, different shapes that we could use to build out platforms and some seaweed that was set up in a way we could do it in different shapes. And because it was underwater, we had a little Kanye West in there and just hanging out. So the next slide, we're talking about banks. And so banks are only possible with specific mappers.
What can you talk a little bit about what a mapper is?
Absolutely. So a mapper is actually the physical circuit board that's being used on an NES cartridge. There was a lot of different kinds back then that all had different kinds of features on them dependent on the electrical components that are attached to it. We use a mapper that's called MMC3 because it's a pretty feature-rich mapper and it allows us to do things like bank swapping, and it allows us to have either 1K or 2K banks, which we call half and quarter banks, to sort of represent how much of the page each takes up. So we're going to use our game Little Medusa as an example for how we used banks. In Little Medusa, we used the 2K half banks to do the character sprites because we knew we were always going to need the main character, but because it was a puzzle game, we weren't going to need to have a large variety of enemies on screen at the same time. We were only going to have the ones that are relevant to the puzzle elements. And then the backgrounds, we used quarter banks, like the 1K banks, because we knew we had a large amount of global elements, like the puzzle elements, the power-ups, the blocks that the player could place down. Those always needed to be loaded into the visual memory during gameplay. So we only needed to swap out one or two of the 1K banks to handle all of the unique level graphics. And so the advantage of doing things this way is that we only need to store, like, say, the main character's graphics once in the ROM, and then we can always just reference that bank anytime we need to see her, instead of having to store her in multiple places and load an entire page at a time. And so one of the best advantages we have for that is that it allows us to have the appearance of a larger variety of things loaded into memory, even though we don't. Because we can load and unload individual banks at a time instead of having to do the entire page of graphics. So when all of the enemies are cleared out of an area, we can just load in a different bank and load up new enemy types. And it seems like we have more loaded in than we actually do.
And that's possible only with specific mappers.
Yeah, that's only possible with specific mappers. And like I said, we use MMC3, which is the same mapper they used for Super Mario Bros. 3, because it has some pretty versatile bank loading, and it has a lot of nice features to it that will allow us to do some cool visual effects as well. So when people think about cool, impressive retro game stuff, they always think about these giant bosses that they have to fight. Like in Mega Man, you fight like the giant Dr. Wily car, or Ninja Gaiden, you fought that giant demon statue that comes in at the end of the game. So you can't do that as a character sprite. You can't do that in the same way you'd render like Mario or a Goomba because of all of the sprite limitations that we have. It just simply wouldn't be able to handle loading that many sprite tiles on screen at the same time. So the way all of those are made is they were created out of background elements. So a large background piece was drawn and animated and used bank swapping to do the animations, like a flip book basically. And then pieces of it might have been built out of sprites. But there's also another large limitation on that you have to keep in mind, is that you can only update 32 of those 8x8 background tiles at once on the NES. That's the most it's capable of doing. Now, when you have something that takes up like half the screen, that's a little difficult. So one way that we've worked around that is we're doing basically what we call frame blending, where we take the animation, break it up into pieces so that we're only animating part of it at a time, and then we play the animation back quickly so that it tricks the eye and makes it seem a lot more fluid than it really is. So with our Toad that we have here, it's an example of us doing this. So in the image at the bottom, you can see that in the first frame is its default state. The second frame is it with its mouth all the way open, which is what the animation that we wanted to use is. But we have an intermediate stage in the middle where he scrunches his eyes a little bit, which is the start of the opening mouth animation, and just the corners of his mouth open up, so that we only have to update the middle of his face for the third frame. And so when we play that all back, on the top image here, we can see that it runs pretty fluidly when you play it back quickly. But if we slow it down, you can actually see the process of the individual pieces being animated separately from each other. And so it's all about figuring out where those separate pieces are going to be, doing the animation, and then just playing it back very quickly so that the human eye doesn't have enough time to sort of catch the trick happening. So the next slide, we're talking about sprite layering. Sprite layering is really cool. If you ever enjoyed anything made by Tecmo, I'm talking about like Ninja Gaiden, Tecmo Super Bowl, anything that those guys have ever touched, they look so cool and cinematic because of sprite layering. So when you're doing a huge full screen cinematic scene, you might want to do some things that sort of skirt the palette rules or animate a little bit more than a background piece could animate. And so you use sprite layering in order to do that. And it's simply just layering sprites on top of a background image to fill the rest of the image out. So we're using Little Medusa as an example again. The very first image is of this boss that you have to fight. It's just one of the titans. And that the first image is just the background part of the image. So it's very plain. She doesn't have a face. She doesn't have any hair. She doesn't have any features or anything. It's just the background piece adhering to the background rules. The second image is a representation of the sprites that we're overlaying. So we're overlaying her hair, so her hair can be a different color without having to worry about attribute tables. We're overlaying her face so that her mouth and eyes can move independently of the rest of her body a lot more fluidly. And then we're even doing sprite overlays with the water that runs between her hands. That way we can flicker the water back and forth on each side of her hands, like in each of her hands, so it has like a nice transparent look to it.
We do all of this to kind of provide a more dramatic experience for the player. You know, if you're going to fight this boss and it's supposed to be this big challenge, this big obstacle, we want it to, you know, not only be hard to fight, but also, you know, look impressive. We want to have things that are memorable for our games. And I mean, doing that requires, again, working around these limitations. But once you understand them, once you have this kind of, you know, deep respect for them from working so closely with them and around them, you start to think like, oh, now that I know these tricks and now that I know how to work with these things, how can I use those to my advantage? You know, how can I make this screen or this encounter, this instance really pop compared to the rest of the game?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'm going to turn it over to you guys for the next slide because this is questions for design, and I'd love to hear from you guys about some of the more high-level design ideas that goes into when we're making these games.
Who wants to go first? I'm happy just to jump in and say that I think it's pretty safe to say that we identify fun factor mechanics that we know are super reliable, super fun, classic, and nostalgic for a reason. They've been around for years and years for a reason, and then iterate on those mechanics, right? So I think we try to identify, tighten up, and produce mechanics that are really, really fun. And then on top of that, layer all the variety, the progression, the look and feel, and everything that you would come to expect as a modern customer on top of that nostalgic or retro mechanic that you know is so fun.
And one of the coolest things about retro games is that they're typically anyone can pick up a controller and, you know how to play them or learn quickly how to play them. It's very intuitive design, and because you know we have these tried and true mechanics, they're accessible by anyone, which I think is something that's missing from a lot of modern games. I mean, most modern games have, you know, numerous tutorials to kind of teach you how to play the game, which can be a barrier to someone that doesn't have the, you know, the time to invest in that. Or you play a game, you put it down for a couple of days, you come back and you completely forget the control scheme.
Or even
typically doesn't happen with a retro game.
Yeah, say, or even just a young person who doesn't have, you know, the reading skills yet. You know,
right?
I love seeing a kid who's definitely early level reader picking up a retro game and just getting it right away and loving it. Like that's what one of the things that made the video game industry what it is today. We were all kids when these games were coming out. We didn't want to read. We wanted to get in there and play. And so retro games are perfect for that.
Another thing we think about is, what hasn't been done on the consoles before. There's been, they've been around for 30 years, and video games have evolved, and there's so many cool things that you see nowadays that, you start to think like, oh, what would this type of game be like on the NES? Or, what if, has this ever been done on, the Sega? And you think about, okay, what kind of new things can we do? What new experiences can we bring to these consoles?
Yeah, definitely. So next we're going to talk about just sort of the level design concepts behind Little Medusa a little bit. And Zach here is the expert. He laid these puzzles out. He is a madman.
Evil genius.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So with Little Medusa, it kind of encapsulates a lot of what we've been talking about as far as the retro design ethos and marrying the best of modern with the best of retro. It originally came out for the NES and has since spread to several other platforms. As you play the game, the first couple levels are designed to teach you the basics of the game. Your basic controls, and you play as a little Medusa, and you're able to petrify enemies and use that to solve puzzles. So the first couple levels teach you how to do those things, and then we just add mechanics and challenges on top of that with different enemy types, different hazards, and as you play through the game, these ramp up until you're facing combinations of challenges you addressed in the past. So that's typical of most retro games as far as tight mechanics, a small move set that's fun. And then as far as marrying the modern to that, Little Medusa is launched with achievements, and it also came out with hidden content essentially that for people that wanted to get the most out of the game and redo every puzzle and get the best high score they can. It's an entire hidden world for them. We also made the game with speedrunning in mind, because there's an Olympian mode where you play through and you only have a limited number of lives, where as soon as you lose all your lives, and you're done. So it's meant to be this like kind of this grueling endurance thing that's like highly watchable because of the risk involved with the playthrough.
So this is another fun slide for me. It's polish and special effects. This is one of the neatest things, especially on the NES to me, to do, is because now you're really taking the console and making it do stuff it should never be able to do. So my favorite examples of this, the first one on the right is the title screen for The Adventures of Bayou Billy. It does this really cool sort of wavy effect where it comes in and then it waves back out. And the way it accomplishes that is that it takes the screen and sets registers at every single scan line of that logo. And then it adjusts the scrolling speed and direction of the logo and uses math to give it that wavy shape to it, and just keeps expanding it out until it sort of either waves out or waves back in. And it's a really cool effect that you can do just by adjusting the scrolling. The other example I have is, in my opinion, one of the coolest looking NES games. It's called Swordmaster. Kind of like an old school, like kung fu style game as far as gameplay is concerned. It's a real simple platformer / beat 'em up, but it does some really cool effects. So you have to keep in mind that the NES only has a single background layer to it. So if you want to do really cool parallax effects, you have to actually use a lot of tricks, and Swordmaster uses all of them. So the way it works is that they actually set a register at the scan line at the ground level, and then they adjust everything below that scan line to scroll faster than everything else. That way it looks like the ground layer's in front of everything. And then with the background, with the trees and the mountains, they're actually using bank swapping animations on the mountains. The game's looking at the scrolling speed and direction of the player character, and it's making an animation happen with the mountains to make it appear as if it's scrolling slower than it actually is. And that gives it that effect that it's behind those trees, even though it's all on the same layer. And yeah, the raster effects and bank swapping animations, when you combine those together, you can do some really cool stuff with it. So next we're going to talk about what we do as far as physical manufacturing goes. This is when the game's all done and ready to be shipped. This is getting our hands dirty. We hand solder every single one of our games. We use through-hole hand soldering. We think it delivers a sturdier product with a longer shelf life than using some of the pre-made surface mounting solutions. So we go through and make every single one with care ourselves.
Literally handcrafted.
Yep.
And so manufacturing is like we are talking about hard copy cartridges for these consoles, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so much involved with that process that it's almost like this phase that people don't tend to think about anymore because everything is digital releases now.
Yeah.
For us, you know, we don't have the luxury of doing like a bug fix or an update or a patch. It has to be right the first time we send it out. So
Where do most sales take place?
We do most of our sales on. We have our own website, megacatstudios.com, and so that's where you can buy most of our products. So with the physical manufacturing, we get to do some pretty cool stuff with the cartridge designs. I love you guys could talk about that a little bit.
So we've done some pretty neat ones so far. We have a wooden cart for log jammers, our NES Lumberjack game. We also have the special edition of Fork Parker's Crunch Out. It has an LED screen that lights up when you plug it into the Super Nintendo. And our goal here is to give something that's shelf worthy for collectors. We want something. We know that they have limited space, you know, in their room or their video game man cave, and we want to have something that's, you know, ready to rock, super cool, that they have, you know, pride showing off.
So why do we do retro games is a question we get a lot. That is probably the top question that we get when we're at conventions or talking to people about what we do. And so I know for me, I am pretty passionate about the NES platform. I'm a collector. I collect NES and the Japanese Famicom cartridges. It's always been a big part of my life. It's what I dreamt about when I dreamt about making games. And there's just still a lot I think it can do and I want to do with it.
I think it's important to remember that that even though these consoles came out, you know, 20, 30 years ago, I mean, the electric guitar came out, what, 60 years ago? But people still make, you know, rock and roll and heavy metal and things like that. So I just see it as more of like a tool for a certain type of, you know, experience or certain type of story. I think that games that came out, you know, in the golden era of the consoles, the 8-bit and 16-bit, I think that they had a certain type of like soul to them that, you know, kind of set the tone for what games had become. That it was like it had that fun for fun's sake kind of ethos. You know, it was different than games today, a lot of which can be, you know, kind of dour or very heavy-handed or serious, which isn't bad. I mean, it's ultimately just a storytelling medium. But I think games from that era really are special because of the way that, you know, because of the way they were made and why they were made and the experiences they offered. So creating more of those, that fun for fun's sake, it's enjoyable having grown up with them for sure.
Yeah, and for my part, I'm mostly focused on the actual play pattern and the fun factor focus, like you just mentioned, Zach. I think games back in those days were made to be pick up and play fun. The mechanics were really, really tight. You didn't have to look for the fun in those games, which for me was one of the best parts. Right, I think you can spend a lot of time in modern games walking around the world looking for the next fun moment. That didn't happen back in the retro time, right? Every frame was made to be a lot of fun. So I think building upon that, but then adding the layers of modern complexity, the progression systems, variety, some of the modern design elements that we see these days, I think is important for the modern consumer. But I really think there is a lot to be said about the pick up and play fun factor nature of what the original consoles gave us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also just finally, we're in an ever expanding digital landscape. And so being able to keep kind of a physical product that you can hold in your hands with a full color manual that has like the story and the lore and the characters, it's really an experience. And we don't want to see that experience ever go away.
Yeah.
There's just something special about it.
There's something different about playing a game on the couch in the living room or basement next to your friends and being able to like co-op with them or play against them, and then I want to be able to throw popcorn at them or elbow them, or it's completely different sharing the same physical environment as opposed to playing online with someone.
Yeah.
It's just there's a different altogether, the essence itself is different.
Yeah, and there's a lot of room to build on that play pattern and build on that foundation.
Okay, so we do more than just retro games though. So we are always thinking about how do we make the jump from retro to the modern day. And so this slide shows a couple examples of our earlier times doing that. It started with Logjammers and Coffee Crisis. Logjammers was made for the NES. It was a lumberjack arcade style fantasy sports game. And then Coffee Crisis was made for the Sega Genesis. It was your side-scrolling beat 'em up like you had back in the day with the Turtles games or Streets of Rage. But both of those games we found to be really fun, really addictive, really cool concepts. So we decided, hey, let's bring these into the modern era. And so what we did is we kept the sensibilities of what made those games fun, and then rebuilt the games from the ground up, using those sensibilities as the core, and remade them in Unity for modern platform releases of them. So as you can see with Logjammers, one of the things that is very noticeably different is that it went from a vertical playfield to a horizontal one. And the reason why it was a vertical playfield originally was because of the console limitations. So once we moved on to 16 by 9 or beyond displays that didn't have those sprite limitations on them, we moved things to a horizontal playfield to give the players more room to move around and just sort of give it more of a natural feel for the displays that it was going to be on. With Coffee Crisis, we again remade the game from the ground up, made it bigger, made it more of an experience, and then we were able to add cool modern features like Twitch integration so that when people are playing the game on streams, people watching the game are able to influence what happens in it. And that's obviously something we weren't going to be able to do on the Genesis, but we could do that once we brought it to modern hardware.
Which I'll add, I think that's really important for any players out there that might have preconceived notions about retro or pixel, to create alternates that are essentially the same play experience, and the same play pattern and the same awesome mechanic and same awesome gameplay. I think it's important to be able to put that in front of as much people as possible, so that they can enjoy the fun factor of a game like that.
Absolutely. And so our next big release was Bite the Bullet, which just launched recently. We actually did that one in the other order. We created this love letter to retro run and guns, where that sort of gameplay was at its very core, but then we expanded on it a whole bunch, and we made that for modern platforms first. But as we started to develop it, we decided we wanted to do something to sort of expand on the lore and the world and the characters of Bite the Bullet. So we went back and started making a completely separate side story specifically for the Sega Genesis.
It's called Bite the Bullet First Course, and like Andy said, it's cool because it functions as a prequel to the story set up in the main game, and it's also a different sort of game. It's more of a traditional Metroidvania, which, getting back to what hasn't been done on retro consoles, um, there's very few, I would say, like true Metroidvanias on some of the older consoles, especially the Sega Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
So it was fun to kind of design one of those,
Yeah.
and be one of the pioneers of that genre on these platforms.
And
Exactly. Oh, sorry, it's just Zach. Is there any crazy like narrative payoffs or anything that like are embedded, like if you're a player of both games?
Oh yeah. There's a lot of crossovers between the two and references, and you get some insight into how one very important boss was created if you play the Sega version.
yeah, and I think what I really enjoy with what we were doing with First Course is that we took Bite the Bullet, which is this fast-paced run and gun, but we wanted to explore its world more. So that's why we made it a Metroidvania, is
Right.
because that gameplay is all about exploring.
Right.
And so tying that gameplay element to the experience that we wanted to provide with the story, I think is working out fantastically.
Yeah.
Are they set like just? I'm just curious in terms of like time wise, years wise, like how much earlier?
They're pretty close. It's not point A, point B. It's not I would say you could call it a year if you wanted to, but it's pretty pretty successive.
Okay. It's not the old Republic of Bite the Bullet. It's not
Right.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Right.
All right, so that was the presentation. Thank you very much for listening. We have a lot of great resources here that you can check out. If you go to megacatstudios.com/blogs, we have an entire blog series all about how we do this stuff. We go in very, very granular detail about how we design the art, how we design the levels, how we design the sound, how we make these retro platforms work. The NES dev community has a great wiki you can check out. Has a lot of, if you're getting really into it and you really want to learn a lot about it, it's a great resource for learning the real nitty gritty of it.
Speaking of our blogs, that's actually kind of our way of giving back to this community. The retro community is there's so many people involved. There's so many people that do different things, whether it's just players or it's collectors or it's developers or it's the artists. And that when we were getting started, we learned so much from so many of them that as we discover new tricks on these consoles or new ways to do things or our methodology and tool chains and whatnot, we share that information as our way of kind of giving back and supporting this community. We never want to see it go away.
Yeah. And then if you guys ever have any questions or just want to leave us a comment, you can hit us at info@megacatstudios.com, or you can get us on social media. We're just Megacat Studios everywhere. And stop by our Discord, discord.gg/Megacat. We love making new friends. We hang out there. Love to hear from you guys. So yeah, thank you guys very much for listening. I hope you get out there and enjoy some retro games.